you. And I think it's not overly casual, but semi-casual. So the idea is that we'll have a discussion, and then if there are questions from the floor afterwards, we can come to you as well. Thank you to all of you for coming out tonight. It's pretty cold outside, so that's a big achievement, lots of snow around the state. And I guess the panel tonight is part of Brain Injury Awareness Week for 2018. It was launched this morning here at the ABC. I was presenting at the time, but I could see a fairly huge crowd out here for the launch this morning, and a pretty lavish morning tea as well that everybody else enjoyed. My understanding is part of the key aims of Brain Injury Awareness Week is to raise awareness of what brain injury is, how it might impact Tasmanians and their families and friends and just the Tasmanian society, and perhaps through that awareness how we can help improve the lives of people who not only have brain injury but the people that live and work with them as well. And that's why it's exciting to be part of this panel discussion, because tonight it's really focusing on how we can take some of the information we know about brain injury and put it into a practical processes of helping people parent their children. I've been a journalist now for about 30 years, and one of the things I really love about being a journalist is you get to learn new things all the time. And I remember being a child, maybe about 7, and I was looking out the window at my grandparents' house over the water, thinking there's so much to learn in the world, how am I ever going to know it all? And I haven't quite got there yet. But the good thing about being a journalist is you always get to meet people who know a lot more than you do about the subject that's being talked about, and that's what will happen tonight as well. I read a while ago that, and actually it wasn't that long ago, that we know more about space than we know about how the brain operates and how it works. And I think that's a really fascinating thing to remember, that all the resources and knowledge that comes from the space race as opposed to the brain race. But from that point of view, what do we know about brain injury, and how can we help people who have to live with that as well? As Deborah says, it's being recorded. So what we might do initially is start to just give some context to the subject, which might seem as some preliminary information that a lot of you already know. But I was thinking later down the track, if it goes online and someone looks it up, then they may have some really fundamental questions about brain injury and what the symptoms of that might be, particularly when it comes to parents. So with that knowledge, I thought I'd introduce the panel to you first of all. Ginna Webster is the Secretary at the Department of Communities, and it's a relatively new department, isn't it? 1st of July, and it brought together a number of other portfolios and departments, amongst them health, human services, I think, and human services and community development and so on. And you've come with a background in justice and child protection as well, so thanks for coming. And Dr. Janine Martin is a neuropsychologist and has spent quite a lot of time specialising treating adults and children with neuro impairment. I know there's another word that fits in there, but I can't pronounce it. That's neuro impairments. So thanks very much for coming along as well. Dr. Frey is an adjunct senior researcher at the Tasmanian Institute of Law Enforcement Studies at the University of Tasmania, but decades of practice and involvement as a developmental psychologist essentially, and working in areas such as trauma and child protection as well. And Dr. Julian Watchorn is the acting CEO of Foster Care and Kinship Association, but is a clinical psychologist and has spent a number of years working in private and public practice, and also appearing as an expert in court cases, and a background in Relationships Australia, I think, as well. So an amazing panel of expert knowledge here. So let's start, before we even get down to some of the specifics about parenting and how we may look at our knowledge of brain injury and how to help parents with that in the area of child protection or child safety and family violence services. If we accept for tonight that brain injury is injury that happens to the brain after birth, perhaps if we could start with you, Jan, and ask, if you were seeing a parent who was to come with you having had brain injury, what sort of symptoms would they be displaying? And you don't have to relay them all. I was just thinking some of the ones that are key ones that you would expect to see.
I guess depending on the nature of the injury, the most common problems that I would see would be emotional dysregulation. So more likely to have difficulty controlling their frustration. They'd be faster at getting angry, getting irritable, having difficulty coping with noise and additional sensory information, but also planning, organising, being able to multitask. There are a whole range. What can often happen is to the outsider, somebody with a brain injury might appear to have memory problems. But on assessment, you might have someone who's got a memory problem. That means that they can't take information in, they can't store it, and so they don't remember what they're told from one time to the other. But you can have somebody else that functionally looks as though they've got a memory problem, but it isn't. It's more because they get easily distracted, they can't focus or concentrate for any length of time, and they can't order their thoughts. They can't plan, they can't sequence things, so they might think of it, things to do, but they can't put it all together so that it makes sense, and therefore they don't remember it. And so often that's what I see with people who are parents and have a brain injury, is that their life is completely chaotic because they can't get things organised, and that tends to affect how successful or how efficient support services are, particularly if they don't actually understand what it is, because where some people, if they have a memory impairment but their ability to plan and organise is intact, then it can be easier, and they've got insight or awareness into their ability, then it's easier to work with them and to have them take on board strategies. But if you've got someone who has difficulty with planning, organising, sequencing, attention, all that sort of thing, and if you put a lack of awareness in that as well, it doesn't matter how many support services they have coming in to give them strategies, they won't be able to implement them. So then they come across as unmotivated or lazy or not interested, and then you have the emotional reactive side as well.
Thank you, and we'll come back to all those points. Julian, with you, of course, parents can have a brain injury before they become parents, and they can be parents and then get a brain injury. Does that make a difference?
It can make a difference. I think the impact is more significant when someone with a brain injury begins to parent, because of the complex nature, I guess, of parenting and the demands of parenting, so that there might be an awareness of some limitations or difficulties in planning, or as Jen was talking about. But I think when they start to become a parent, then the complexities of parenting become overwhelming for them. So perhaps prior to parenting, they still had an acquired brain injury, but the demands were far less upon them. The demands of multitasking, the pressures, the sequencing, there's so many demands there that I think for many people, parenting is very difficult. But I think if you have the limitations with an acquired brain injury, then it's overwhelming. But it becomes immediately apparent, I think, that they have an inability to manage a lot of those things, as Jen was talking about.
It's interesting, when we were talking around the office just about this topic, everyone was saying it's hard enough to be a parent at the best of times, and all of us do a bit of shouting every now and again and fail to be organised or forget that it's book week, which apparently a lot of parents did this week as well. And Ron, I guess then that leads us to issues of things like neglect, because traditionally a lot of people working in this area might look at neglect as a reason to consider whether a child needs to be taken away. But for a parent with brain injuries, is neglect a facet of some of those symptoms?
It is, and can I describe a couple of aha moments that I had? So my background is trauma work, and I've been a child protection worker and worked in child protection for 40 years. And I came to these aha moments really late, and I think that probably is an indictment on the lack of knowledge that so many professional people in child protection have. But when I started working with, for 11 and a half years, I was a child and family therapist at a place in Brisbane called the Tolera Centre, where we worked only with children in care and with people who've been exposed to family violence. And working particularly with mothers who had been exposed to family violence, it became really apparent that a large number of them had been strangled at some point. They often didn't use the word strangle, they would use the word choke. But it was still the same thing. Someone had their hands around their neck and had cut off their air. And I can think of one mother in particular that I worked with whose partner would do this as a kind of a punishment for her. And I suddenly realized that this was really quite ordinary, that this was an experience that a lot of women, at least, had had. And I saw a statistic recently of a group of women interviewed in refuges in England, and I think it was either 70 or 80% reported being choked at one point or another, being strangled. And of course, this leads to loss of oxygen to the brain. And I actually have the statistics here so that I remembered them correctly, but for every second that you lose consciousness, you lose 32,000 brain cells and 232 million connections. So if this is something that happens frequently, then what happens is it begins to impact on the mother's ability to parent. Now, as a child protection worker, I would come out and look at the mother and see her as neglectful, and not understand that, in fact, this is a further symptom of the terrorizing atmosphere that she lives in. And Evan Stark, who writes a great deal about coercive control, often says that there is one event in a family where there's a lot of coercive control, where early in the relationship, where the partner will take his wife, or husband, I guess if it's reversed, to the brink, and then never need to do that again because he's so terrified her at that point. But it's a very common thing, and so consequently when child protection people are intervening in families, they are often looking at what they think is neglect, but what actually might be evidence that the mother is living in a really terrifying situation, which has had a strong neurological impact on her.
One of the things I did find when I was looking into this, there are so many facets to brain injury, as we talked about. And Ginna, if I could bring you in with your background in child protection, how would you react to Ron's comments there?
Well, I think that's absolutely right in terms of making sure that our professionals in child safety are absolutely trained as well as they possibly can be to identify when there is a brain injury present. Can I just pick up one of Julian's points, though, too, around the pre or the question you asked there around pre or post-parenting brain injury, whether you're already a parent and then you have a brain injury. I think the thing to remember is the impact on the child as well. If the parent has a brain injury after they become a parent, that the difference between the parent seeing the child seeing the parent pre-brain injury versus post-brain injury can also have an impact on the child in terms of, I want to remember what mum or dad was like before the brain injury occurred. So there's also that impact, I guess, which no doubt you would say, Julian. I think the issue for child safety services is that we screen for risk. And so one of the things that we would screen for is the risk to the child. How do we then identify better that the parent has a brain injury, and we need to refer then to get that risk, or to get the screening done for the brain injury. We would hope that our child support officers are attuned to that. But of course, because of the difficulty in diagnosing brain injury when it hasn't been diagnosed, it makes it very, very difficult for our child safety officers. So I think there are two things, education and how do we better inform our child safety officers, and secondly, making sure that our kids don't end up at child protection in the first place. And so we would be seeing that by the time child protection get involved, or child safety we call it, Tasmania, it's not too late, but it's pretty late. And so how do we then wrap community services and family support around the parent to get to the point earlier where they get the support they need before child protection are informed? And that includes involving the non-government sector and our other agencies, health services, so that there's wraparound services before someone notifies of potential abuse or neglect.
Could I just ask all of you then, again, what about the hypothesis then that parents with a brain injury, either before or after they become parents, are more likely to neglect their child or to mistreat their child? And how would that play through into a sort of a child protection assessment? And maybe, Jan, if I can ask you that.
Actually, that's a really interesting question. I don't know if I can answer that, because usually by the time I see somebody, they have the brain injury.
We can come back to you if you want more time.
Maybe you can come back to me, because I'm just trying to think, as you say, you're saying the person having the brain injury after they've become a parent versus having a brain injury.
Well, no, I'm more interested in just a general sense that are parents, either before, if they have an injury either before or after, irrespective of that, are they more likely to have their child taken away from them or find themselves, and assessed for child protection?
Oh, I don't know the answer of that. I don't know if there's any research that looks at that. It would depend, I think, a lot on support services, previous coping mechanisms, because the things that I see, whilst people can have a brain injury and I can assess them and they'll have almost identical results on assessment, what plays into their functional ability to cope are more environmental factors. So it will be their socioeconomic status, what their support network is like, what their personality traits were like, what their coping resources were like prior to having the injury. And so that can make a big difference on how they function after they've had the injury, because there are some skills, of course, that are not impacted by brain trauma. And if they have good sound skills beforehand and they've got a supportive network, then they're not going to have the same difficulties with parenting that somebody who doesn't have those initial skills, resources of any sort. So that's more what I would say as far as the effect of that. But looking at, is there greater statistics if they have a brain injury before or after becoming a parent? I don't know. Sorry.
Ron, I mean, this actually points to maybe where we need to look at is to provide more research, for example.
Yes, we certainly need more research. I'm like Jan. And I feel the need to call it very conservatively here. I think having a brain injury, parenting is probably the single most challenging thing any adult does. And the second probably most challenging is retaining a relationship with the other parent. But given that, and given the complexity of parenting and the wide range of executive functions that are required by parenting, I think certainly having a brain injury would make a already complex task even more challenging. But I also agree with Jan, all of the other factors, the community factors built in, can perhaps take some of the weight that would normally be carried by one's own neural net.
Does that suggest, and I guess coming to both of you, that if you're from a particular background, if you've got good coping skills and you do have a brain injury, that you're less likely to be find yourself and your child being assessed by child protection officers? And
I guess I'd answer that by saying parents don't just find themselves at child protection, that it's very, very, very few parents want to harm their children. And so it's the other causes of abuse and neglect that we really need to look at. So is it poverty, homelessness, certainly mental health issues and brain injury, drug and alcohol issues. So again, it's about how we early get intervention services early for those families. And I think then when we look at brain injury in particular, it's about asking the right questions and providing the right plan for the parent to address some of the issues that we might have. So, for example, we have, a map that where child safety services can safely do so, we always want to reunify the parent and the child, or the parents and the child. And part of that is to work out a map and work out a plan for parents to work on certain factors that might have brought us into contact with them, whether or not the child is still living at home or whether they're actually in out-of-home care. The issue then is the way I see it, if we've got a parent who has an acquired brain injury, how do we make that plan suitable for their injury and for their capacity? So there's no point coming up with a 3-page plan that's overly complex if they're having trouble remembering things, or if their motivation is lacking and they're not grasping why they might grasp it in the meeting with the child protection officer, but when they walk out the door they forget how they're going to do that. So how do we provide community support services to enable that? And there's an example that Maria Harries, who has done our child protection redesign process here in Tassie, will tell us, where, and it's not a Tasmanian example, but where a parent who was at the cusp of having their children removed was simply asked, what would help you? And she said, well, actually, I'm on medication and I find it really hard to wake up in the morning, and so I can't get the kids off to school by 8:30, and they look a bit dishevelled and they haven't got their lunch because I'm really foggy in the morning and I can't, cope before 10 o'clock. So what would really help is if you had someone help me between the hours of 8 and 10. And so that kept 3 kids out of the child safety system, the child protection system. So I think it's having a plan that's the right plan for that parent and that family, and where it isn't safe to do so, then we do have to remove the children.
Julian, did you want to comment at all?
I think we're talking about neglect as opposed to abuse, and I think neglect can be a cumulative thing. So it's like we have a large window as far as coming in and providing support. I think it's easy to misread situations where we see someone and we assume that they're not well intentioned, so they're sleeping in, so they don't take their child. As the example you gave, I've seen many examples of that, where suddenly schools assume that the parent is not motivated, as opposed to any other issues that are hindering their ability to adequately parent. But some of it's just cumulative emotional neglect, that hopefully starts to get picked up, possibly by schools. Schools are a good monitor of that. But I think it's that understanding of the acquired brain injury as a core part of it, as opposed to misjudging, and so easy to misjudge. And I think it's been an eye-opener for me reading the sort of background material, because I don't look for brain injury when I've been doing assessments. And the figures are so high, I should be doing it. So I feel that I've been missing it. But often it's not just a brain injury, it's a mixture of mental health problems as well. But an understanding of their capacity is so important to then understand how to deliver services. But as Ron was saying too, it's a balance between their capacity and ability and what other supportive family infrastructure there is as well. And so a risk assessment covers both of those things, both the parent but also the environments for things. So.
It's interesting, because you say as a psychologist you may not have necessarily been screening for brain injury. You mentioned schools there, and of course schools are some of the first ports of call, and yet my understanding, and Jan, you were talking about this in your initial comment about symptoms that someone may have in brain injury, is a parent might rock up at school, they might lose their temper with a teacher, they might be frustrated, and that may then flow through to authorities, where there's been an investigation. Is that common, Ron? Having been involved in child protection, I just wondered, would you believe that schools should be doing more to think about acquired brain injury?
Well, and also schools are focused on education, so most certainly they should. Nothing more to say than that.
With some parents who have an acquired brain injury and child protection are involved. I had one lady who she had 6 children, and one of the things that was happening with her is she was becoming very wouldn't let anybody come in, was not turning up to appointments, all that sort of thing. And what I realised when I assessed her is that she had too many services involved. And because of her brain injury, she couldn't integrate what one service was telling her with what another service was telling her, and she couldn't work out like what we might do, you know, if we were involved with, say, 3 different people and they were all giving us information that would be helpful. You'd pick and choose from each what was going to work for you, what was similar, and how you would apply it. The person with brain injury can't do that, so it just becomes overwhelming for them. They can't take on the information. It gets too confusing because they've got too much information, and what happens then is they just back off. Don't want any more people in my house. I'm not going to let anybody in. I'm sick of going to appointments. I'm sick of being told I have to do this or I have to do that. I just can't do it.
And I guess, Ron, from your experience of being in the area for quite a while, what about the sharing of information? I mean, even to get to the point where you have too many services, do the service providers, do they share information easily about, I mean, we were talking before about financing services for, say, in the area of family violence, where one organisation might receive funding to deal with men's issues, someone else for women, someone else for children. And I just wondered, when it comes to something like brain injury awareness and training, how easy would it be to sort of resource it in a model that allowed people to share information?
Well, my experience is they certainly try. I think for a lot of us, I think we're in the same situation that Julian is, that it's not, brain injury probably isn't the first thing we think about. It's probably, I would guess, drugs or alcohol, and probably intergenerational trauma are the things that probably are the first things that you would think about. And the fact that brain injury can underpin both is just not something that there's enough awareness of. There's a tremendous need for education. So you could have all the people sitting around the table and the point could still be missed. But I certainly take your point. I was at a case conference a while ago with a 14-year-old boy, and there were 25 service providers around the table. And his grandmother couldn't make it that day, so those were the only people who were around the table. He actually had not a single family or a person in his life who wasn't paid to be there, and this often happens for kids in care, and I imagine it's overwhelmingly confusing. So given that you've got people trying to share information, I think unless people actually consciously think about it, and as I said, talking with Deb about strangulation was just opened my eyes, and it shouldn't have. I should have known that. so I'm here for my sins, I think.
Julie, let's go then for Ron's comment about the boy who was over-serviced, I guess. What about children? Because we've talked about the parents who are coping with a brain injury. I mean, in your role with the sort of the caring, and I guess the old name of foster caring and so on, what do children say if they know that their parents have got brain injuries? Are they aware that that might be an issue?
They are, as Ginna was talking about, if it's been acquired during parenting, so that the children will often see a huge change in their parent.
And can you just maybe for people watching this later down the track who aren't from this sort of background, what sort of changes might they see that will really impact them?
I guess they'll see a lack of tolerance, emotional dysregulation, often a disconnection from the child because the parent may struggle to empathise, may struggle to remember important events. And there's a whole range of changes that can occur, including significant changes to family structure. So it may be that one parent can no longer work, so the other has to come home and care for that parent. So there's such significant changes, I think. And then there's the concerns that the child may have with the stigma of having a parent who has an acquired brain injury and not wanting that to be known to other people, or the need to almost for them to care for their parents because the parent is struggling to look after their own needs, sort of thing, which is really is not helpful, but it often occurs that there's suddenly the child takes on the emotional responsibility for the parent. So huge changes occur for a child, and I think it's important that any intervention is tracking the child as well as the parent, and assisting the child to understand and facilitating the relationship between the child and that parent with acquired brain injury, because often it's there's a disconnection or the deterioration in the quality of the relationship between child and parent.
And I'm also assuming that for some of those children in families with siblings, they might have to take on a greater role of just looking after younger brothers and sisters, for example, which may then impact on their ability to do other things, either outside of school or in school as well. So, given that, why isn't it sort of standard practice for people working in child protection to think about assessing for brain injury?
I think for all the reasons we've outlined, that it's probably not, it hasn't been front and centre for professionals in the field of brain injury. So for our staff who are social workers, they are much more in tune, I think, to dealing with the conditions after it's been diagnosed and screened. So as I said, we screen for risk, and it's one of those risks. I think it's certainly a challenge for us keeping children together. You know, when there's you mentioned a caring relationship, that the child often becomes the carer, and if there's siblings involved, it's a very, it is a challenge to keep the family together in those instances. So I think the earlier that it is detected it's far better if it can be detected earlier. I think it would be probably unrealistic for child safety services to do that screening, and I think the importance of knowing where we can go to get that advice and to get that screening and to get to refer to psychologists, to forensic psychologists and specialists in Tasmania is paramount. I think, without sounding like a bureaucrat, I'm probably going to sound like a bureaucrat, by saying the child safety reform that we're doing brings together the non-government sector, child safety services and other service providers in our children's advice and referral service, which actually then, instead of a child safety officer just being the one at the end of the phone, there are other specialists and other services that the child safety officer can say, hang on, I need to get some help and support on that. And that's probably been the missing piece up until now, is it's just sometimes we are the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff and we're the last port of call, and we don't necessarily have the skills to deal with the issue. So the more people that we can involve early in the process, the better.
Yes, you sure can.
The other thing is, I think we're just now really understanding the neurological impacts of maltreatment and neglect and everything else, so that we still have not yet developed a kind of deep understanding where we look at a child and a child's behaviour and we can see kind of the underlying neurology of that child. And as a result of that, it's probably the reason why we tend to go for other issues. But things like drug and alcohol also lead to traumatic brain injuries. Chronic abuse and neglect impacts on the developing brain, all of these things. So in a sense, the pervasiveness of brain injury across quite a number of risk categories, I really think is still being understood, and therefore it's taking a while for that to filter through to practice.
And we'll come to questions from you in just a moment, but maybe, Jane, if I could just come back to you. The issue, given that we said we don't know a lot about how the brain works and we're finding out more about it, things like trauma though, I mean, the ability of trauma to have an impact on the brain and, you know, be seen maybe in the years as a brain injury of sorts. How is it changing for you to diagnose someone with brain injury?
Well, I guess that's evolving as well, obviously, with testing. With the testing, it's not just the scores that you get, but it's also observing how the person approaches it, marrying it with what the difficulties are that they're saying they have. I mean, my assessment starts from the time the person walks in the door, and really looking at how they speak, how they articulate, what the problems are, you know, whether their mood, you know, what their mood is like. I don't know that probably the approach is a little more in depth, and the more we learn, the more that the assessment is adapted, and we learn more and we look in and tease out things. Is that what you?
Yeah,
that's what you. Yes.
You've got a more refined diagnosis.
Yes, although it's still difficult. I get very specific questions about, you know, is this the reason for this? And sometimes, a lot of the times, it's a case of, I can't be that definite, you know, that because it's rare for me to see people where there's only one problem. So when people are referred to me for an assessment, they might have a brain injury, but they may also have drug and alcohol problems, and they have financial stress, and it can be housing, or it can be lack of social support, or it can be any number of things, and mental health illness as well, because a brain injury can lead to a mental health diagnosis. You know, a severe one, because people can become psychotic occasionally with a brain injury. So very rarely is it, this is it. Although I'm expected to be able to say, well, this part goes with the here and this part goes with there, but it's not always that easy to do that. So you have to take everything into account. One thing I just would like to say about sometimes with parents and young children, I had a young woman who had a very severe brain injury. She had two young daughters. I think they were only about 2 and 4 at the time of the injury. And one of her difficulties was disciplining the children, because all she ever did was smile. And so when she was trying to discipline the children because they'd done something they shouldn't have done, the words might have been the discipline, but she'd give it to them like this because she actually couldn't do anything else. And that negated, so her body language wasn't matching what her words were saying, and she would get so frustrated with it because that was just part of the brain injury, and that's part of this emotional the emotional affect. So you do get this occasionally, not all the time, but with somebody with a frontal lobe injury, or a particular frontal lobe injury, they will laugh inappropriately or they'll cry inappropriately. So they might hear a joke and it mightn't be particularly funny, but they'll laugh and laugh and laugh and laugh. Or like this particular woman, she just smiled all the time. I don't think in the 2 years I think I was working with her, I don't think I ever saw her with a different facial expression other than a happy one, but she certainly wasn't happy all the time, and that actually caused a lot of problems for her with her children.
Okay, thank you.
Can I make a comment before we go on? Just a few comments around that. One thing that Ron brought up is sometimes when we're assessing parents or children, what they're showing can belie a range of different issues. And unfortunately, if we're not cautious, then once we form a judgment, then we view everything within that. So it's a very tricky area. A couple of things come up for me. One is I haven't so much dealt with parents with acquired brain injury, but certainly having learning difficulties or cognitive deficits. And it's a process of discovery in regards to what they understand. They often need an advocate for them because they are unable to communicate clearly with child safety services. And sometimes they need someone to facilitate the communication as well. I've got one case at the moment where we're assessing cognitive functioning of a parent, and she's very dysregulated emotionally. She becomes aggressive. There's a breakdown in the relationship between the parent and child safety services because they don't want to deal with her because she's angry all the time. But the more I discover, the more I realise she has difficulty regulating emotion. She has intense emotion, so it's not her choice that this is going on. And the other is she struggles to contextualise. So if she's told to do something, she can't apply that to a different context. So it looks like laziness or a lack of motivation. But inherently, it's about assessing their skills and ability and their cognitive ability to then know how to relate to them. So it's not necessarily, sometimes it's that early stage communication just doesn't work and nothing will work beyond that sort of thing.
Just a final question then from me at this stage to you, Ginna, because I can't let that one go because of course we hear in the media all the stories of the huge turnover amongst child protection officers, lack of resources, increased paperwork, more reported cases and so on. Given then what people have said, do you think that there's a positive outcome to this?
I think just to clarify, the turnover of child safety officers is no different really to other organisations. I think it's extremely complex and challenging work, and I think the issue is that we will often not recognise that someone needs a break from that role, move them somewhere else and move them back in. Because I think often when we're dealing with really complex, challenging and very confronting issues, sometimes you need to move people sideways and say, let's have a break for a while and then come back in. So I think, again, the opportunity for, and it picks up something, Ron, you said around the number of services involved. So I think if there's one learning, it's sometimes that even if child safety services are involved, we don't have to be the lead agency. In fact, sometimes it's preferable that we're not. That we have to be able to let go and let other agencies or other organisations or not-for-profit organisations take the lead with a particular matter because they might be better equipped to do that. So I think, you know, again, in terms of a plug, the new department gives us that opportunity. It puts those support services under the same roof, under the same secretary, under the same umbrella, and we have a great opportunity here to try and address that and get it right. I think what we do need to think about in terms of the work that we do with parents is Julian's absolutely right. Our child safety officers, because they're dealing with these issues every single day, it's complex. Nobody just says, okay, take my children away from me. It doesn't happen, but the court actually make that decision. So, you know, we have a process that we go through, but the child safety officer is the front line. And so if you can bring in an intermediary, if you can bring someone in that actually acts as the facilitator, sometimes it's just easier. And someone like Julian may see things that we don't see because we're dealing with it every day, the parent's dealing with it every day. So I think if there's a learning out of it is sometimes you just have to step back and say, hang on, we're not getting through to the parent. We have written a whole list of things that they're just not doing. And we need to ask why more often. I think that's the one thing that we have been talking about as an organisation in the last, you know, we're in early days, 6 weeks. We should be asking why more regularly. And the other thing that we're looking at doing is collaborating more with other organisations and NGOs. And we're actually going to go out on the road with TASCOS, and we're going to go around organisations, and we want organisations to inform our strategic plan. Because we can't get it, you know, we can't get it right just ourselves. We've got to rely on other people to help us with that process. And it is about the community. So I think if there's a learning, we've got to open ourselves up for some of that criticism that we get. Of course, in the media, you do only hear, and I have to say, you usually only report on the bad news stories. There are lots and lots of really good news stories where child safety officers go above and beyond to work with a child, even if they're out of care. They're 18 years old, they're 19 years old, they're still in contact with their child safety officer. There's lots and lots of stories around that. But of course, any neglect, any abuse it should not be tolerated. So we're trying to address that, and of course that's the headline story, and I understand why that's the case. But there are some good news stories too about what we do.
Thank you. Would anybody like to ask a question of the panel? I can keep going because I've got lots of questions, but I'm just asking anyone here who'd like or to make a comment from where they sit. Yeah. So, Rosalie, let's start with you. Maybe I don't know how we're going to do this, but.
Rosie Martin, I'm a speech pathologist. I was just struck by what Julian, that bit of discussion there between Julian and Ginna, and what Julian had said about, not being able to pick up on necessarily all of the cues that were there. I was struck, perhaps you didn't quite say it that way, Julian, but I was struck how important it is to remain involved with the family and to remain involved, with that kind of a compassionate approach in order to be able to understand these complexities, because we can't see them all on first glance. And, one-off assessments or two-off assessments are never going to give the texture that's required to really respond. And so, yeah, I felt that in what you were saying, Julia. It struck me how important that was.
Back to Rosie's comment. Yes, this is also true when you work in the domestic violence space as well. The women who eventually commented that they had been assaulted by their partners, they'd been strangled, never offered that in the first interview. It was often working with them for a very long time before they mentioned it. And either it was because it happened with frequency, so they didn't think it was unusual, and so therefore it didn't merit being mentioned, or alternately it was very embarrassing. And so they didn't want to admit that this was happening at home. So I quite agree. You really have to. The longer you know someone, the better. Hopefully, you'll understand them.
Can I comment on that as well? A common experience I've seen, which makes it difficult for child safety, is a lot of families feel threatened by child safety, and so do not want to disclose too much information for fear of losing the child. And a lack of disclosure means we have a lack of information to assess. And so there's that factor that I think comes up time and time again, in that we can't do an adequate assessment because the family have closed down, or they're terrified that the children are going to be removed, and therefore they don't want to admit any limitations or problems they've had or anything like that. So another complicating factor.
Yes. Someone else had their hand up to make a comment? Okay.
I'm just very curious about the link between domestic violence and trauma, head injury, brain injury, and perhaps our work in child protection. If you'd like to comment a little bit more about that.
Well, only that I think the link is very much unexplored at the moment. It's something that is only gradually becoming known. The state of Queensland now has a specific offence of strangulation, and the last time I checked, one person a day was charged with it. So it's very common. It happens a lot, and the link is then that leads to serious brain injury, which in turn leads to neglect and other sorts of factors. And I think Deb shared a study that was done in Queensland, wasn't it, with 30 mothers who had children who had been taken into care. 25 of them had depressed executive function due to, well, I guess we don't know what due to, but possibly due to strangulation. And the other 5 had mental health issues. So certainly where you have neglect and that sort of thing, there are links that people just don't make. People don't think that strangulation is common to begin with. Secondly, people don't make the link between strangulation and acquired brain injury. And then thirdly, people don't make the link between acquired brain injury and neglect. So it's like a number of links that need to be made before people can actually start assessing that, understanding it. The problem is when we do child protection assessments, quite often we don't see the father or the person in the house who may actually be doing a lot of the committing a lot of the violence, we tend to talk to the mother. And if you don't put the father into the equation, if you don't have a full picture of what's going on in the house, then the mother is often made to carry the burden for anything that's going on in the family. I mean, mothers often do assume that they are responsible for the total emotional well-being of their children and their families. In child protection, we tend to make that same mistake. So we would look at the mother and we would say, well, you're not a good parent, you're neglectful, without asking further questions like, are you in danger? Have you been harmed? And if you have ever been in a situation where you are choked or strangled, you apparently have a 750 times the chance of being killed by your partner. And also, people who wind up going and committing massacres and that sort of thing, almost all of them have had previous offenses of choking their partners, strangling their partners. So there are lots and lots of links. There's a wonderful American site, and I think it's actually something like www.strangulation training, which is kind of misleading as to what they actually do. But it's put together by the medical examiner from Louisville, Kentucky, and Gail Stark, who is was the assistant DA in San Diego. And the two of them got together and they've been training police forces all over the United States, and I've done their training in Queensland. And I think that was the first thing that opened it up for me. I had never thought about all the women who were just saying this, you know, in so many different sessions, but I never made the link, hey, this is common. You'd think I would have gotten it, but no, I didn't. I really had to attend the training, and then suddenly the penny dropped, and then talking with Deb, the penny dropped again. So those are the kind of connections we need to make.
Just on that, before we go to some other questions, Julian, if a partner does have acquired brain injury, does it actually make it harder to find a partner who would be supportive of them, for example? Do they tend, you know, if maybe they'll end up in relationships where they do have a controlling partner?
Possibly, either that or they become so self-protective that they don't try and find a partner because the risks are too great. They struggle to meet their own needs, let alone the children. So, but they are vulnerable to abuse and domestic violence or family violence. Yes, they're very vulnerable to that, which just adds insult to injury as far as the stress they're under and the impact that has on parenting.
Anybody else who'd like to make a point?
I should be all right, Sarah. Chris Oriel, Executive Officer of HOPES Inc., a cooperative housing organisation for people with acquired brain injury. And I'm a school teacher by trade, so I'm very interested in the conversation tonight. I'm prefacing this by saying that I'm speaking with a backdrop of support for the ongoing viability of BIAT, which I think is vitally important in their work.
That's the Brain Injury Association of Tasmania.
Thank you, Sarah. Yes. My query is that given that a potential organic component of acquired brain injury is that can be a lack of insight and a lack of self-identification, I was wondering if the panel, maybe Jan and maybe some of the other people, could talk a little bit more about the prevalence of acquired brain injury, and also possibly a lot of the people that don't identify as actually having a brain injury but are actually having some, cognitive issues, sort of almost along the spectrum.
I can't comment on the prevalence, but if you actually meant prevalence of lack of insight with a brain injury?
More about the prevalence of acquired brain injury.
Prevalence of acquired brain injury. No, I can't pull those figures up, sorry.
Okay.
And the second part of the question was?
The lack of insight, as sometimes being a cognitive component of ABI, and the difficulty that means for a lot of people in self-identifying and accessing appropriate assistance.
Yes, lack of insight is very common. And when you are working with somebody who doesn't have an appreciation of the fact that, one, that they have cognitive limitations, but more often they don't have an appreciation of what their behaviour is or what the consequences or effects of their behaviour are, it's much more difficult to work with them on a one-to-one basis or in a therapeutic situation, because they don't see the point. There's nothing wrong with me. I don't need help. It's somebody else. Or it will be things like everything would be better if I had a bigger house, or I had more garbage bins, was another one that I got once, or I have more money, or the government would increase payment, or they'll provide me with more support, because they don't recognise that that they need to be responsible for their behaviour, because they don't see that their behaviour is a problem. So a lack of insight sometimes is the biggest problem when trying to work with someone with an acquired brain injury. The other thing too is that people who do have a brain injury often don't want to be defined by that, so they won't tell anyone, because they look fine, they're walking and they're talking and they're socialising, and they feel as though it is a stigma, so they don't want to tell people that they've got a brain injury, and then that just compounds the problems when it comes to parenting and needing supports and things like that.
Sarah, I can just give a bit of information about the prevalence, if you like. So in terms of prevalence, there's a recent study in Victoria around ABI and family violence, and they found that there are 3 women each week hospitalised as a result of ABI, family violence, ABI, that nearly 1 in 3, or 31% of victims attending Victorian hospitals for family violence matters were children. And of those, 1 in every 4 sustained a brain injury as a result. And brain injury also accounted for 14 of 17 family violence-related deaths over 10 years. So that's probably just the tip of the iceberg, really, I think. So in terms of prevalence, it's obviously extremely common, and then the connectivity to family violence is obviously extremely common. And I think that's the thing that we have to keep asking ourselves in all our services, but particularly child safety. Why? Why is this the case? Why is this the case? And, you know, Sarah, I know that you raised the issue of the complexity and the number of cases that we have. I mean, our aim is to reduce those number of cases, so we have more opportunity to ask those questions around why. Why is this parent behaving like this? Why do they say when they're in the room with us, yes, of course, I'll do that. We have a plan, and then we have the next meeting with them and nothing's done. And those are the sorts of things that we have to start asking why, and we have to get the professionals around the table with us to help asking those questions.
Can I comment briefly on that as well? Just around the insight factor, I think that, you know, as we've already spoken about, parents with ABI often aren't aware of the limitations or don't have insight into how ABI can hinder their parenting capacity. To me, it suggests that we need to be better at, in that initial assessment time, rather than relying on the parent to provide the information that gives us the cause of their problems, is to recognise that they may be very hindered or hampered in being able to provide that information, and therefore it's up to us to explore and in a safe environment, so they're willing to talk about it, but to explore history, and to be one of the flags we have is ABI and being aware of that, and how can we've talked about how many different ways it can weave in as well. It's not, do you know what I mean? It's often when I think of ABI, I thought of it like a motor vehicle accident, sort of like, okay, that's ABI, isn't it? But it's not. As we've said, there's a whole range of factors that can lead to acquired brain injury. So I think that, and as you've said, I think lack of insight on the parents' part means that we have to be cautious in our assessment and discovering information that gives us a better understanding of their abilities.
I was going to say, it's just so interesting for me to listen to it, because I think to myself, it might be one thing to be saying, as a parent, to say, well, I can pinpoint, and I was riding down Sandy Bay, I got hit by a car, and therefore I have a brain injury, which, as you say, as the panel have said, might be an easy thing to disclose, as opposed to I'm in an abusive relationship, which then may open up a whole stack of other issues and, raise concerns about what happens to your children.
It doesn't even have to be in a violent relationship. Somebody can not be aware of the fact that they've had a brain injury because they've sustained between 10 and 15 concussions in sports, and they haven't actually ever been hospitalised, and they've said, oh no, I was knocked out, yes, I lost consciousness, but I was fine after that. And the evidence is that cumulative mild traumatic brain injuries, there's a cascade effect, but the actual changes in the brain, and then therefore functional changes, aren't always obvious for more than 10 years. So they may have had the last one in 2000, but it might be now that they're having cognitive difficulties and functional difficulties. So it might be that you'd ask the person, have you had a brain injury? And they'll say no. And then my spiel is, have you ever lost consciousness? Have you been knocked out in a sport? And then it comes out. Or one question I ask is, have you ever broken anything? And then you find out that they've had a broken bone, and and then you go from there. So often they don't know. I just want to make a comment about one of the characteristics of a frontal lobe injury is a person, particularly if they were pre-morbidly reasonably high functioning, is that they can sit and they can actually tell you what they need to do, what steps they need to take, but there's a disconnect between knowing and doing, and that is a very common frontal lobe problem. So it's not that they're lying, it's not that they're being lazy, or they don't have motivation, or they don't have initiation. It's because they actually can't translate that knowledge into action, and that's often misunderstood.
Did anybody else want to raise a question or raise a point? That is an interesting thing, because I was just thinking then about generations, a lot of us from the same generation, when you played sport and, as you said, you got knocked out and you got back up again. And for people in relationships with, say, former footballers, or even now I think in another few years, people who've done a lot of skateboarding, they may not realise that they've had an acquired brain injury as well. I think we can wrap it up there, because there's so much to think about here, but some final comments. One of the things I do want to ask about is the legal process. And so we've talked about self-awareness, self-assessment, or assessment through clinical psychology and so on. But often by the time it gets to the idea of taking children away, parents are having to appear in court, and I guess that adds another layer. And my interest is how much are child protection services or the legal system, how much are they aware that someone could have acquired brain injury?
Well, I think the court system itself, the justice system itself, and I know that Rosie has done some work on this, and my previous role in the Department of Justice is that it's a very complex system for those of us that know how to navigate it. And my goddaughter rang me a few months ago and said she needed to fill out a form where she'd, run one too many red lights or one too many points, and she was going to try and get a restricted licence because she was studying at UTAS and up north. And she said, I can't understand the form on the internet. Can you just help me? And I looked at it and I said, I can't understand it either. And I've worked in the system and my literacy would be quite good comparatively. So I think we don't make it easy for anyone. And I think that some of the work that we've been trying to do with the Justice Disability Action Plan and that the work we're doing I'm certainly working with a number of organisations to say, how can we make it less adversarial? So I think to answer your specific question, I think by the time it gets to that point, we're probably not thinking about that. There's a separate representative that is allocated to the child, so the child's interests are represented. The parent has a lawyer, we have a lawyer. By the time it gets to that point, we're probably not thinking about that, Sarah. And I think we need to be thinking about it well before that point, but also making sure that we've got a checklist by the time it does go to court that says, as a state, that we have an obligation to look after the most vulnerable people in the state, and children and young people are certainly in that, but parents with acquired brain injury are also vulnerable. So how do we balance the needs of the child, which have to be paramount, with the needs of the parent? And it isn't an easy process.
I spent a long time as a court reporter, so I can agree that it can be a difficult area to navigate. And on that, some of the things that I think about was the idea of asking an expert for a definitive position. I mean, that's what, you see medical experts and so on brought in, and the defence or the prosecution wants to know definitively what the issue, and you've raised some of those issues that you can't always be definitive, and just the idea of actually keeping up with proceedings. They can move along very quickly in a language that's not always easy to understand. Julian, you've given, sort of expert opinion in courts. How have you found it?
I'd like to give an example that I think makes you aware you can come right to the brink with someone before you realise they have limitations. I had a child protection case where, I don't know if it was ABI, but there were certainly significant cognitive limitations with a mother and daughter. And it went to trial. And I was being cross-examined and they were providing me information. It was at that stage I had to say to the magistrate, I'm really concerned these parents are self-representing. I don't think they understand the process, and I don't think they can give their lawyer instruction. But the lawyer was so sometimes lawyers are unaware of the cognitive limitations of their client. So we had this farce of a court case that we got all the way almost to the point where an order was going to be made, an 18-year order, so the children never go back to the parent, or basically never go back to the parent, before it got to a realisation of that. And that's so it sort of, to me, it made me aware how far it can go before we pick up on some of these things. That they've been engaged with child safety for a couple of years, sort of thing. And I'm not criticising child safety for this, but it is deceptive. But if they get to the court system, they need a lot of help and support. They need an advocate. They can't advocate on their own. They need an advocate for them. They need someone to facilitate communication with the court. Otherwise, it's like putting a child in an adult's world. They just don't have the capacity to communicate and represent themselves. So I see that as I think the court system isn't designed often in that way. And again, we're all being, as I admitted earlier, I'm becoming aware of how significant ABI is in a whole lot of cases that may have I've assessed before and missed it, sort of thing. So, or how they can co-occur with other issues, or cognitive deficits, and then. But that was just an example of how sometimes the court system isn't able to assist parents with significant cognitive deficits or ABI, and it's so apparent that they need advocacy services. Yeah.
That doesn't even touch on the sort of the waiting times you might have to hear your matter in the family court, or access to legal services and lawyers and so on. Ron, do you have anything to say about that?
I do. The court process also depends on your ability to be rational, to give a narrative account that starts at A and ends in B, and doesn't go to C, D, F, or Z. And this is precisely what people with acquired brain injury and people who are traumatized can't do. So the almost, for me, if I'm trying to judge someone's story as true, it's almost the incomprehensibleness of it that gives weight to the actual veracity of the account.
Interesting point. On that, there's so much to think about here, and I think the great thing is we've all had our awareness of acquired brain injury raised, even just tonight, sitting here and preparing for this. Let's just go around the panel, and Jan, start with you. What do you think needs to be done in terms of resourcing, particularly at the state level, because we're in Tasmania, but at the national level, to make the awareness of acquired brain injury front and centre when we're assessing, things like parenting and child safety issues?
Given that I don't have a good appreciation of the internal workings of child protection. One of the things that I think could be helpful would be employing a neuropsychologist and an occupational therapist who is has an expertise in brain injury, along the lines of they could, because I've worked with OTs before, and we work really closely together in the identification and then marrying up how functionally the person could. And I was thinking about if there was somebody in the department, full-time positions for a neuropsychologist and an OT working together, they could provide a range of things. They could provide education and training to frontline workers and keep that update, so refreshing things, so it would be an ongoing. They could provide advice and also look over, if a person has a brain injury and there are reports on that person's brain injury, they may not need another assessment, but it would be helpful to have a neuropsychologist look at the report, be able to interpret it and translate it into functional things. They could do assessments as required, but also maybe run workshops or support groups for parents who are going through the process who have an acquired brain injury, so that one, they see they're not the only ones, and to take some of that stigma away. So I can actually see a role for a neuropsychologist and an OT in the department itself, that I think they could provide a lot of services that would bring things together, and maybe that's one way that help could be arranged. I mean, the other ideal is so unrealistic, I'm not even going to put it forward.
But you can say it.
Well, I just think it would be really nice if we had something like a rehabilitation brain injury unit, but for families, because I do know that there's a service, and I can't bring the name up at the moment, where if the mother is identified as struggling with a new baby, that she can go in and she can live in and she can get the supports around it, but the father can't. It's only for the mother, and that doesn't work. And I assessed a couple recently, and this was offered to the mother, and she's only a young mother, and she didn't want to go in there without her partner, because her partner was her main support system. And it was such a shame, because she'd benefit a lot from going in there. It would be just wonderful if we had the resources to have an in-house, somewhere where people could go in, they could live there as a couple with their children and be able to learn what they needed to do, not feel stigmatised, but develop some good things. But I realise that's totally unrealistic, because it would take a lot of money. But that would be one of my ideals, that would be really well supported and manned by people who are experts in the area.
Yeah, I'd like to see some parenting programs specifically designed for people with acquired brain injury. A lot of the parenting programs that people do require a lot of insight and often literacy skills and quite a number of things beyond the capacity that people might actually bring to this. And I would also like us to think broadly when we think about a program like this, in that you wouldn't necessarily be doing a program like you might say, understanding adolescence or something like that, where you go for a certain number of weeks. It might actually be a whole raft of things that could be brought in to support parents who are parenting with acquired brain injury, but we don't have that at the moment. I'd like to say we're hoping to develop it at UTAS with the support from the Brain Injury Association of Tasmania, but at the moment this is still something that needs to be done. So that's what I'd really like to see.
Yeah, I agree with Ron around tailored programs, specifically for adults with acquired brain injury. the other things I've mentioned before is either advocacy or third-party support for parents with ABI, so they can be assisted in dealing with organisations with child safety, with the court system. Probably raising awareness with any organisation that's involved in this area, in this arena, including child safety officers training. Certainly, as I said, I've only become aware of the I guess the enormity of it and the link, particularly as Ron's talked about with family violence as well. I think that as a community we're not aware of a lot of these factors, and I think that's sort of certainly an education program that's taken out to schools, to services that support parents and families is important, so that there's an understanding of what it is to have an acquired brain injury and how that impacts on their learning and how that then tailors towards programs for parents.
They all sound fantastic. Fortunately, in terms of raising awareness and training, Deb Brewer, who's our Quality Improvement Workforce Development Manager in Child Safety Service, is sitting there. So she's picking up lots of ideas around how we can better target raising awareness for our staff, which I think is really important. I think one of the big things for me is early intervention. So early intervention around, if we're talking child safety services in particular, rather than the treatment and the programs for parents, we need to make sure that we put money into the front end and not wait until the child and family are at our doorstep. So we have already started that process, but we are progressing that this year. And it was interesting, the Institute of Sport and Recreation is part of my portfolio as well. And we wouldn't say to an athlete, the Olympic Games are on in a month. No, you've never run 100 metres before, but there you go. We expect you to compete competitively for a gold medal in the Olympics. But we expect parents, we expect families, we expect kids that end up in Ashley, and we expect people that come into contact with our services to automatically solve their problem quickly. And so if you're developing an Olympic athlete, you start when they're that big. And so it's foolish to think that when we're trying to solve these really complex problems that we start at the end of the process. We have to start at the beginning of the process. So anything that can divert our services and our funding to that, it will be worthwhile in the long term.
Can I comment up on that briefly? In that we had David Thorpe,
yes,
came out from the UK, Professor David Thorpe from Lancaster University. They've been modelling, they have a model in the United Kingdom that's around early conversations, and child safety are trying to adapt that to working that into their assessment and referral service, where the earlier the conversations, the more conversations, the less likely as a child will come into child protection care. And so I think that's a great model, but it also needs the fear factor taken out, I guess, for parents or any parents who feel, okay, if I have to engage with child safety, then I'm at risk. So there's a whole lot of promotional stuff that needs to go with it, but I think it's when he came out and talked about it, and he showed how effective it is in very low SES areas in the UK, I thought that early, basically the research says the more conversations child safety have with parents, friends, families, networks earlier on, the less likely it is for a child to come into care. So there's a saving, an emotional saving, and a huge financial saving as well. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I think we'll leave it there. But on that note, I think that's also a great way to say thank you very much to Brain Injury Association of Tasmania for holding a panel like this, having the week to raise awareness. I know that there'll be coverage in the media and getting the discussion happening. And we should mention that I was going to say BIAT, I guess I could say BIAT, is celebrating 20 years this year as well, and it's basically Deb and Rosie that hold the fort as far as I know. So much to think about, so much work, and also, good to hear that you're in charge of community sport and recreation, given that we talked about that. Are we asking in a couple, has this person been knocked unconscious on the sporting field? So even asking in those sort of areas in under that same roof. Thank you very much for coming out. As I said, it will be recorded, so if you know of people who might be interested in this who couldn't come along, then there'll be a provision to see that afterwards. But if you could just thank our guest, Ginna Webster, Secretary, Department of Communities, and also Dr Janine Martin, neuropsychologist, thank you, and Dr Ron Frey from UTAS, amongst many things, and Dr Julian Watchorn, who's the Acting CEO of Foster Care and the Kinship Association. Thanks so much. It's been a really great discussion, so thank you very much.